Ask Mixing with Mike, hyping up stereo instrumental tracks. So in this, I want to go over a quick way to take an instrumental track and kind of hype it up. So quite a lot of producers and artists today work with stereo instrumental tracks that are brought in from other producers, people who write beats and put together songs for people to record raps or record their lyrics and melodies over the top of. And of course, these things are always limited because you get the mix that they give you and you get the production and the layout and the arrangement that they give you. So to some degree, the productions can vary greatly. Some of them are largely generic in nature, which allows you to add on other instrumentation, which is a good thing. So it gives you some creative control. So it may just be something as simple as sound effects and drum loops, and you get a basic idea of what you're working with, and you build your arrangement around it accordingly. And you could do some editing work and some basic things. But what I really want to focus on today is just getting into some of the basics of how you would go about processing something like this. So if the track is the mix is somewhat dull, not exciting at all, then the performances that are laid on top of it are not going to be much better. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of go over some basic techniques that are really mastering techniques that can help you kind of bring the excitement and the aliveness out in the mix. So the first thing I'm going to start with is I'm going to check out my levels coming in here. So it's actually at a fairly decent level. The instrumental track is really somewhere like around -10, and that gives me like a good starting place. So I'll start working from there. And usually what I start off with is I start off by putting in a high peak filter and or high pass filter and a low pass filter. And what this does is it creates a little bit of focus around the overall track. You notice here that I have like a little bump, right? So there is a and this is common with filters. It's like called a resonant filter, where you get a little bit of a bump. So this is an HEQ, which happens to have that in the US vintage setting, and many plugins have this built into the EQ circuitry. It gives you some control. And if you don't, you could always slide a parametric over to that frequency on the sub and then just dip it in. So this will give it an extra kick down on the low end, and we'll tighten up the frequencies on the high end, really above 17K or so, which is kind of mostly noise anyway. And you'll want to kind of keep that air most likely for the reverb and the vocals and stuff anyway. And the sub frequencies, which you're either not going to hear or going to be too low end, or going to distort most speakers anyway, and make everything sound really muddy. You want to cut that back a little bit. So you can hear right there, this almost sounds like we're adding high frequencies and hype on the low end, even though I've done very little, okay? Another thing I can do here is I can do a shelving EQ, and this is more like a bass and treble control kind of thing. So I'm going to start like somewhere around 400 cycles or so, and just do a slight dip, maybe like a dB.5. And then I'm going to do a shelf here on the high end, maybe start like around 2K or so, and then boost by like about a dB or so, maybe a dB.5. And so what this does is it's giving me, it's like the shelving EQs are going to affect everything below 400 and everything above 2K. I'll leave the mid-range alone. And what this is doing, it's like just kind of doing a little bass treble control. Is what I like. So we're filtering off the top and the bottom here a little bit, and then we're just kind of giving it a little bit of a tonal balance before we start to apply any kind of compression to it. And this opens up a little bit of mid-range as well for the vocal to kind of sit in there, so that when we get that vocal, we'll still have the warmth from the track, but we need to cut a little bit of a hole in there for the vocal to kind of work in. Another thing that I like to do here, which is using analog tape, and I think when working with analog tape, one of the great things about working with analog tape emulation is that it's a form of compression. Tape compression is really what we're using, and the great engineers who worked with analog tape, and I worked a lot with analog tape in the early days when I started recording back in the early 1980s. It was an art form, really understanding tape saturation and how you could use that. So I like to think of it as like a kind of mid-band compression. It should bring up the overall level and strength. And there's a lot of tools here that we can use to open up the sound. So one is just, I just want to kind of keep mine from getting too high here, but really what I want to do here is just Set my flux level so I'm getting a decent amount of tape compression. So that's without it. So you could hear the presence, almost like a volume, and that's a lot of what that harmonic distortion. It adds depth and character and space to it. Now, it also adds a little bit of sizzly or brightness at the top, and so I'm going to switch to 7.5 inches per second speed, and what that does is going to give me a little bit more of a ballsy low end and kind of warm up the top end a bit. So you hear the brightness difference. And if that was a little too dull, I could go to a nominal bias, which should give me a little more high frequency. So let's go with that, because that kind of gives me a little bit of the grit and a little bit of the openness, kind of the best of both worlds. And the next thing I want to go to is low-level compression. So what I've really done is I've kind of done a basic tonal balance, given it sort of like a good overall compression, and I could use another type of compressor, like a Neve compressor, or maybe a Fairchild compressor, something like that would also be very good for this type of thing. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a low-level compression, and I really love this because what the low-level compression does is it compresses signals below a threshold and brings them up. So, and this is kind of a cool kind of compression that you don't see a lot. Most of the compression that you see or limiting is downward. It's always above threshold, signals get pulled downward. This is taking signals that fall below threshold, which is all the air and presence in the track, and pulls them up. So here, you have a listen. And of course this is going to add volume here, so I'm going to just kind of bring my gain down. So I still have room to work. And then I can also do a little limiting from the top down. And hear how it brings in a little bit of presence. Now, if I leave the gain up here, then it'll always sound dramatically better, but it'll be too loud. So that's really what it's doing. And then I'm using the make down gain to make up for the fact that, you know, I'm going to be adding gain by doing the upward limiting. And what it should do is give it a little more air, a little more presence. I use the loud setting here that just gives it a little bit more of an aggressive nature. Now, another thing that I can do here is to work with the transients to kind of make them pop a little bit more. Transients, you can see I'm using all here, is a cool plugin, and this is one thing where you use a range and a sensitivity control, and what it can do is pump individual bands for the transient peaks that happen within that area, and you could determine how long those transient peaks last or pop out, and adjust the sensitivity accordingly. And this is adding a whole other level. So it's just making those snare, those claps, and the kick hits kind of pop out a little bit more. If you wanted something that was a little more delicate and focused, or a little bit more accurate and focused, then you could do something like a C6, which does a similar type of thing, except for you can focus very narrowly into specific frequency areas. So I can make the kick drum specific frequencies pump, and the snare clap frequencies also pump right here, and this would kind of be... And I can also work with the 4 individual bands, very much like the Transients, and get that to kind of pump and breathe and move in a very similar way. So in a way, I like the more focused nature of this. I can also take the Q here and widen this low end frequency. I like it a little bit more focused because it creates less of an issue. And now we're starting to get a little bit of clipping here at the owl pit. So I'm going to pull my gain down here by a couple dB to give me a little bit of headroom. And this is like a good way to start. So let me just actually leave it. So you can hear, if I now take these guys all the way, this is what the original sounded like. EQ. tape. Really hear that brings up the mid-range. Low level compression. And then pumping in those individual frequencies, right, for the transient hits. And then if I really want to just kind of maximize my gain, and this is something that I can do here, I can control it here. Now what I would do here probably, because I'm going to leave some headroom at the output of my track, even though I can actually set the output gain here to be lower, so this gives me plenty of room to work with giving some volume from my vocals to sit on top of. So even though the way this is unusual, what this is doing is anything above threshold, the overall level is actually being pulled down, not up to the output ceiling here. And then this sets a nice stop point for everything that's going on. I want to make sure that I'm not quantizing. I can turn my dither off. I think I skip through it. There we go. And of course, well, if that's off, then there's no noise shaping. It doesn't matter. And just work with this. So now from these basic things, that's my original. And now I've got some kind of hype and presence and spread, and so I'm bringing in all that energy. It sort of spreads the mix, so it takes it from being a bit more mono-ish and kind of pulls up some of the side frequency energy. And then I have a good starting place gives a little more inspiration for laying down the rap or whatever the vocal might be in this particular production. Okay, there is our Ask Mixing with Mike about hyping stereo instrumental track.